Napoleon Bonaparte, one of history's most powerful and divisive figures, was, after his abdication in 1814 and again in 1815, exiled rather than executed. One might wonder why. On the surface, the monarchies of Europe did have their reasons to do so. After all, he was the man who sought to bring the British economy to its knees, implementing the so-called continental system. The man who on more than one occasion embarrassed the Austrian and especially the Prussian military, thought to be at the time the mightiest land army in the world. He was a person first admired by his Tsar Alexander, but would later be branded as a tyrant and an enemy of the Orthodox faith by the same man. But above anything else, he was a man that completely disrupted the balance of power in Europe. He would endanger the hegemony of the British Empire up to that time, and while he was alive, there was always the possibility that he would do so again. But on closer inspection, it isn't quite as simple as it seems, and a more nuanced approach is necessary. First, we will consider the factual background. After the disastrous Russian campaign in 1812, which proved calamitous for France, Napoleon's army embarked on a winter retreat. The harsh climate, rampant disease, and Russian guerrilla tactics devastated the remnants of Napoleon's military. Subsequently, France faced another defeat on the opposite side of the continent in June 1813. Spanish, Portuguese, and British forces, led by Wellington, achieved victory in the Peninsular War after the Battle of Vittoria. This left Napoleon in a precarious situation, with France under threat on two fronts. Outnumbered and outgunned, his forces suffered a decisive defeat in mid-October 1813 at the Battle of the Nations near Leipzig, marking the bloodiest military conflict in Europe before World War I. Following this defeat, Napoleon withdrew to France and was compelled to abdicate in April 1814. Under the political influence of Tsar Alexander, Napoleon faced exile to Elba, but the conditions were relatively lenient. Elba became an independent state under Napoleon's rule. He also retained the title of emperor and was given 600 men under his command as his personal guard. Geographically close to France and Italy, Napoleon could still exert influence over his supporters. Bonaparte remained in Elba a little less than a year, and while he was there, he observed attentively the political situation in France and Europe as a whole. He recognized that the alliance between the members of the coalition was weakening over territorial disputes. Napoleon was also aware of the dissatisfaction of the French people over the return of the French Empire to its old borders. It was also evident that the French military did not support the return of the Bourbon dynasty under the rule of Louis XVIII as the new king of France. Seizing the moment, Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to power. He was able to do this partly because of the support of the French military. His return to France marked the beginning of the 100 Days' War, culminating in his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. After surrendering and unconditionally abdicating, Napoleon faced exile to the distant St. Helena, completely isolated from Europe. Stripped of his title as emperor and with significantly fewer men under his command, he would remain there until his death in 1821. Now it is important to note that after his escape from Elba, the animosity of the coalition towards the man grew substantially, and Napoleon was branded as a criminal and an enemy of humanity. Soon after, calls for his execution appeared in certain circles, most notably in the Prussian military. Other members of the coalition mostly didn't share this sentiment and sought less extreme ways to deal with Bonaparte. This is one of the reasons his life was spared. He simply didn't surrender to the Prussians, but to the British, who proved to be more lenient towards him. But the question still remains why the other members of the coalition backed his exile on 2 occasions in a row rather than demanding his head. Part of the answer can be found in a letter sent by Wellington to the British diplomat Charles Stuart regarding the Prussian Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Brachure, which reads as follows: "Brachure wishes to kill him, but I have told him that I shall remonstrate and shall insist upon his being disposed of by common accord. I have likewise said that, as a private friend, I advised him to have nothing to do with so foul a transaction, that he and I had acted 2 distinguished parts in these transactions, to become executioners, and that I was determined that if the sovereigns wished to put him to death, they should appoint an executioner, which should not be me. This letter tells us that Wellington was almost repulsed by the idea of executing Napoleon, and that executing a ruler simply wouldn't be common practice at the time. That leads us to one of the reasons as to why they didn't execute him. It was simply taboo to kill a sovereign. Killing a ruler was generally avoided throughout the Middle Ages and continuing into the Napoleonic era. Killing a ruler of a country incites unrest in the populace and creates additional political problems and providing fertile ground for rebellion and general instability in the region. Moreover, it set a perilous precedent for future conflicts. Therefore, the preferred method to deal with enemies was the exile of sovereigns, ensuring stability by relocating them to a distant location, given the lack of advanced communication technology that could rapidly address immediate dangers. Essentially, their concern was that executing Napoleon would transform him into a martyr. Napoleon was by and large still popular in France, despite years of war, destruction, and bloodshed. His enduring popularity, particularly among the French military, can be attributed to various factors. Not only was he a brilliant politician, leader, and reformer of the French military, but Napoleon also skillfully portrayed himself as a genius and valiant defender of the French people. He cleverly positioned himself as not the instigator, but the responder in most wars during his reign, which made it easy for him to present himself as a genius and valiant defender of the French people. Because the coalitions of Europe initiated most of the conflicts during the Napoleonic era, Napoleon usually used this to justify the expansion of the borders of the French Empire and the creation of puppet states throughout Europe. Despite proclaiming himself emperor, Napoleon managed to maintain his image as a respected general. Even before assuming the imperial title, he had become the most celebrated and respected general in France by the time of the Brumaire coup in 1799. His fame further soared with victories in the Italian campaign, where he dictated a peace treaty to Austria over 6 years before becoming emperor. Formally, Napoleon never abolished the First French Republic. According to the Constitution of Year 12, he held the title not of Emperor of France, but Emperor of the French. The text of the Constitution that proclaimed this reads as follows: "The government of the French Republic is entrusted to an emperor, who takes the title of Emperor of the French. Justice is administered in the name of the emperor by the officers whom he appoints." Napoleon's adept use of propaganda also played a significant role in securing support. In the face of military setbacks, such as the Egyptian campaign, he strategically manipulated information reaching France, downplaying failures and attributing them to the deceased General Jean-Baptiste Clavert. The French campaign in Egypt even contributed to his political rise. Another clear example of his expert use of propaganda are the numerous paintings and other pieces of art commissioned by Napoleon himself, the most famous of which were painted by Jacques-Louis David, who was then regarded as the leading painter in all of France. His painting Napoleon Crossing the Alps best exemplifies the ideas the emperor wanted to express through artwork. Napoleon is depicted as riding a horse with a specific hand gesture, a frequent motif in David's work, which illustrates his commanding presence. Beneath him is his own name etched in stone, next to the names of famed military commanders Hannibal and Charlemagne, that centuries before him also famously crossed the same mountain range. This signifies that Napoleon is their successor, and that his name will be etched in history and mentioned alongside revered military leaders.